What happens when the lifeline you depend on disappears overnight? When the very air you breathe, the water you drink, and the food you eat suddenly vanish? It's a question nobody in Silverton, Nevada thought to ask. Not in the autumn of 1887. The last train had arrived on October 14th, loaded down with everything the town needed. Flour, salt pork, tinned beef, coffee, sugar. Supplies they counted on like air and water. The train left that same afternoon, heading back down the mountain. Nobody gave it a second thought. Another train would come in 2 weeks. They always did. It would bring more goods, keeping the remote mining town alive. That train never arrived. 5 days later, on October 19th, the trestle bridge at Morgan's Gorge collapsed. Summer floods and autumn rains had weakened it. The bridge gave way under the weight of an eastbound freight train. The locomotive and 12 cars plunged 60 meters into the canyon. The engineer and fireman died instantly. Silverton's only rail connection to the outside world was gone. The nearest alternative was 260 kilometers of mountain road. Within weeks, winter would close the high passes, making it impassable. Silverton was cut off. The town had perhaps 6 weeks of food left. The panic started slowly, as it often does. Whispered concerns turned into public arguments. Then came the grim realization. The math did not lie. 437 people, 6 weeks of supplies, a winter that would last at least 5 months. The numbers did not add up, and no amount of rationing could make them work. The town's very survival was now a question. By December, the flour was gone. Then, in January, the last of the salt pork and tinned beef vanished. Hunting parties came back with less each time. The animals had moved to lower ground, beyond the reach of men stuck in passes buried under 6 meters of snow. Silverton was facing starvation. It was a slow, terrible death, the body consuming itself when there was nothing left to eat. But on the eastern edge of town, in a small house with a root cellar dug deep into the hillside, Prudence Calloway climbed down a wooden ladder. She looked at her wealth. 800 glass jars lined the shelves her husband had built before the fever took him. Jars filled with preserved vegetables, fruits, meats, and sauces. They glowed like jewels in the lantern light. Tomatoes were the color of rubies. Green beans shone like emeralds. Peaches in syrup caught the light like amber. Venison, rabbit, and elk all pressure canned using methods her grandmother had perfected back in Pennsylvania. They had called her crazy for filling those jars. The town said the food would spoil. They called canning an Eastern affectation, something not suited for the frontier. A widow wasting her time on glass jars and boiling water, that was proof, they said, that grief had unhinged her mind. The storekeeper even stopped selling her jars after the first 300. He claimed he wouldn't contribute to her foolishness. So she ordered the rest from Elko, paying shipping costs that made her neighbors shake their heads in pity. Now, the storekeeper's shelves were bare. The supply train was a pile of wreckage in Morgan's Gorge. Prudence Calloway's 800 jars held perhaps the only real food left in Silverton. She climbed back up the ladder into the gray light of January. She looked toward the town that had dismissed her. Smoke rose from chimneys where families burned their furniture to stay warm. The streets were empty. It was too cold to go out, too hungry to have anywhere worth going. The children would be crying by now. They always cried when there was nothing left to eat. Her chestnut mare, Sage, nickered from the small stable. Prudence had named her for the scrubby plants that covered the Nevada hillsides, hardy and persistent in conditions that killed more delicate things. "They'll come today," she said to the horse. "Or tomorrow. Pride can only hold out so long against an empty stomach." Prudence Calloway came to Nevada in the spring of 1882. Her husband, Martin, a skilled carpenter, had heard stories of the silver mines in the Comstock region. They were hiring, offering wages that sounded like pure fantasy compared to what he made back in Pennsylvania. They sold their small farm, packed everything they owned into a wagon, and headed west. They truly believed hard work and good luck would see them through. Martin found work right away. The mines always needed carpenters. They built tunnels and supported the heavy machines that pulled silver from the earth. Prudence, meanwhile, tried to make a home in this strange, dry land. It seemed like the land itself fought against all her efforts. The soil was full of rocks and alkaline, nothing like the rich earth where she grew vegetables in Pennsylvania. The weather swung wildly, from brutal heat to bitter cold. There were no gentle seasons. The closest reliable water was a spring 3 kilometers from town. Fresh food came from the railroad depot in Elko, nearly 100 kilometers away. She adapted, just like all pioneers did, but Prudence also held on to the old ways. Her family had survived for generations because of them. Her grandmother, Eliza Calloway, was a master of food preservation, canning, pickling, smoking, drying. Eliza knew every trick known to farm wives in the eastern states. Eliza taught Prudence's mother, and her mother taught Prudence. Now, Prudence carried that knowledge. It stretched back through generations of women who understood that summer's abundance had to be captured if winter's scarcity was to be survived. Back in Pennsylvania, this knowledge was common. Every farm wife canned. Every cellar held rows of preserved food to last through the months when nothing grew. But in Nevada, things were different. These mining towns had sprung up around the railroad. They relied on regular shipments from the outside world. Why preserve food when fresh supplies arrived every 2 weeks? Why spend hours over boiling water when tinned beef was easy to buy at the company store? The old ways seemed pointless in a world where commerce had replaced self-sufficiency. Prudence disagreed. She had seen what happened when supply lines broke, during the war, during droughts, during the economic panics that swept through the country every few years. She had learned from her grandmother that the only food you could truly depend upon was the food you preserved yourself. So, she planted a garden in the rocky Nevada soil, coaxing vegetables from ground that fought her every step. She traded with hunters who passed through Silverton, exchanging her preserved goods for fresh game she could can. She saved every jar, every lid, every ring. They were precious resources. Martin supported her. He built the root cellar deep into the hillside to keep her jars cool and dark. He built the shelves that held her growing collection. He never questioned why his wife spent so many hours on work their neighbors called useless. He understood, in the way good husbands sometimes understand without needing an explanation, that this was important to her in ways that went beyond practicality. Then, in the spring of 1885, Martin died. A fever swept through the mining camps. Prudence was a widow at 34. She had a small house, a root cellar full of preserved food, and no real reason to stay in Nevada, except she had nowhere else to go. She stayed, and she kept canning. The people of Silverton saw Prudence at work, and they did not like it. Emmett Sloan, who owned the general store, thought he knew everything about frontier life. He built his business on a simple truth. Miners needed supplies, and he was the only one selling them. A woman who put up her own food was a woman who did not need Emmett Sloan. He took that personally. "The Calloway widow is filling jars again," Sloan announced one summer afternoon. People gathered in his store to buy things and trade gossip. "She must have 300 of them by now, all lined up in that cellar of hers. Claims they'll keep for years." He paused for effect. "I give them until Christmas before they spoil and poison whoever's foolish enough to eat them." Laughter filled the store. Everyone knew the fear of bad canned food. Jars not sealed right could grow deadly bacteria. Stories of families sickened by spoiled preserves spread through every frontier town. For a widow with no real training to try something, even professional canneries sometimes failed. It seemed like arrogance, or worse, suicide. "She'll kill herself with those jars," said Ida Hollister, the mine superintendent's wife. Ida saw herself as the one who set social rules in Silverton. Or worse, she'll share them and kill someone else. The woman should be stopped before she poisons half the town. The whispers grew louder over the next few years. Prudence was wasting her time. She was asking for death. People said grief had touched her, that she sought meaning in useless work because her widowhood was too empty to face. When she brought preserved food to church socials, people politely turned it down. Jars she tried to give to families with sick children were refused with barely hidden horror. "We don't eat from unlabeled jars," Ida Hollister told her. Ida turned away from a jar of preserved peaches Prudence offered when the Hollister baby was teething. One never knows what might be in them. Prudence stopped offering. She kept canning. By the fall of 1887, her cellar held 800 jars, 5 years of steady work, thousands of hours, hundreds of pounds of food. Vegetables from her garden, fruit bought from travelers before it could go bad, meat from hunters who were happy to trade for canned goods even if the town wouldn't take them. Her cellar became a quiet store of plenty in a town that just assumed food would always arrive by train. The first few weeks after the collapse, a strange sense of denial settled over Silverton. People kept waiting. Surely the railroad would get fixed. Supplies would arrive by wagon. Someone, somewhere, would realize Silverton was trapped and send help. They rationed their food carefully. They believed the systems they relied on simply couldn't fail. But the systems did fail. The railroad company made it clear the trestle wouldn't be rebuilt until spring. The gorge was too deep, the land too hard, and winter was already too close to start construction. The wagon road, their only other way out, was already buried under the first heavy snows. No one could pass until the thaw. Silverton was truly on its own, with whatever food was left inside its borders. Rationing started right away. Mayor Thaddeus Whitmore organized it with the grim efficiency of a man who knew that mathematics did not negotiate. Every household supplies were counted. Food was given out from Emmett Sloan's general store, which he still ran, even though his shelves were empty. Hunting parties went out. Foraging teams searched the frozen land. Every possible source of food was found and shared. It was not enough. It could never be enough. 437 people could not survive 5 months on 6 weeks of food, no matter how carefully it was managed. The first death from starvation came in late December. Old Josiah Crane, a retired miner. He had no family, too much pride to ask for help. They found him in his cabin, wasted to nothing. He had given his last few rations to a neighbor's children. He couldn't bear to watch them suffer. His death was a warning no one could ignore. The second death followed in early January, then the third. The weakest started to go first, the old, the sick, the very young. Their bodies simply couldn't hold on with the watered-down broths and grass soups that passed for meals. Silverton was dying slowly and inexorably, eaten away by a famine that should have been impossible in a town that had seemed so prosperous. If you're finding this story compelling, subscribe. The town's darkest hour is about to meet an unexpected solution, and you won't want to miss what happens next. The town was dying. People watched their neighbors fade, their own bodies growing thinner each day. It was young Sarah Whitmore, the mayor's daughter, who finally spoke the words pride had kept silent. She was just 18, gaunt from the rationing, her eyes holding a desperate hope. She found Prudence after church one Sunday. The sermon had been about faith when trials came. "Mrs. Calloway," Sarah said, her voice barely a whisper. "The jars in your cellar, the preserved food you've been making for years, is it still good?" The admission was hard. It choked in her throat. Prudence looked at the girl. She saw the fear, the exhaustion, the shadow of death in those young eyes. 18 years old, and she'd seen too much. "It's still good," Prudence said. Her voice was calm. 800 jars, properly sealed, properly stored, vegetables, fruits, meats, enough to make a difference. Sarah's next question hung in the air. She couldn't form the words, but Prudence heard it anyway. "Why haven't you offered it? To people who spent 5 years telling you it would spoil? Who said it would poison anyone who ate it?" Prudence's voice was even. There was no anger, just facts. "I did offer, many times. I was refused. They told me one never knows what might be in unlabeled jars." Sarah's face flushed. Shame burned in her cheeks. "We were wrong. Everyone was wrong. Mrs. Calloway, people are dying. Children are starving. If your food is good, will you help us? Even after how we treated you?" Prudence stood silent for a long moment. 5 years of mockery, 5 years of whispers. They had turned away her offerings. They had dismissed her skills. They had called her mad, dangerous. They saw her preservation as evidence of a broken mind, not valuable knowledge. Now they needed her. The very jars they said would spoil were the only real food left, the only substantial food supply. Prudence looked out at the dying town. Her mind raced through the long winter, the empty streets, the children's cries, the faces of those who had died. She thought of Josiah Crane giving his last rations to a neighbor's children. She thought of her own quiet work, the hours spent over boiling water, the steady click of seals. The future she had seen was now the present. "Bring people to my cellar," Prudence said finally. Her voice was steady, firm. Families with children first, then the elderly, then everyone else. She laid out her terms, simple and clear. "I'll show them what I have. I'll teach them how to use it, and I'll ask nothing in return except that they learn, that they watch and remember. so they can preserve their own food when this is over. The town had come to her, humbled. Pride can only hold out so long against an empty stomach. Now the question was, could the long-dismissed wisdom of one woman truly save them? That afternoon, Prudence opened her cellar. The people of Silverton saw the hidden abundance. It had been there all along, beneath their feet, while they starved above ground. 800 jars lined the shelves. Each one was organized by what it held and when it was made. Prudence's neat handwriting labeled every jar. The lantern light caught the colors. Red tomatoes glowed like rubies. Green beans shone like emeralds. Golden peaches pulsed like amber. Dark preserved meats offered a deep, rich hue. It was a rainbow of food, a sight from another world compared to the gray, hungry one outside. The first jar she opened held tomatoes, put up in the summer of 1886. She passed it around. Skeptics leaned in. They smelled the contents. They examined the seal. The food was perfect. As fresh and wholesome as the day it had been canned. Its color was bright. Its texture was firm. The aroma was exactly what preserved tomatoes should smell like. Ida Hollister, who had once turned away Prudence's peaches with barely hidden disgust, breathed out, "How is this possible? It's been over a year. How is it not spoiled?" Prudence's answer was simple. "Because I know what I'm doing. My grandmother taught my mother, and my mother taught me. The seals are good, the processing was proper, the storage is cool and dark. Food preserved correctly will last for years, not months. Every jar is a promise." She started handing out food, carefully, methodically. She stretched her supplies as far as they would go. Each family got enough to add to their meager rations. Meals of watery broth became soups with substance. The grass and bark desperate people had been eating were replaced with actual vegetables and meat. 800 jars couldn't feed 400 people forever. But they could make the difference between survival and starvation for the weeks left until spring. More importantly, Prudence taught. Every family that came to her cellar left with knowledge, not just food. She showed them her methods, the jars and lids she used, the boiling and processing techniques, how to spot a good seal, the dangers of doing it wrong. She explained what she had learned from her grandmother. This was knowledge passed down through generations of women. They understood that abundance had to be captured to survive scarcity. "This is not complicated," she told them again and again. "Any of you can do this. The equipment is simple. The techniques can be learned. The only thing required is the willingness to do the work before it is needed." The supplies lasted 11 weeks. 11 weeks of vegetable soups, fruit preserves, and canned meat. These supplemented meals kept families alive when everything else had failed. 11 weeks of gradual improvement, the worst of the starvation pushed back. Bodies began to recover from the edge of death. 11 weeks of learning. The women of Silverton watched Prudence work. They absorbed knowledge their grandmothers had possessed, knowledge their generation had forgotten. No more deaths came after the jars were opened. The children who had been wasting away started to gain weight. The elderly who had been fading found strength returning. The town that had been dying began slowly to live again. The railroad was repaired on March 23rd, 1888. The first supply train arrived the next day. It brought provisions that were welcome, but no longer desperately needed. Silverton had survived the impossible winter. They had endured a 5-month siege with only 6 weeks of official supplies. Only 4 people died from starvation, instead of the dozens or hundreds the numbers had predicted. Everyone knew why. The town gathered in April. The spring sunshine finally melted the last of the winter's snow in the town square. Survivors assembled there. They came to acknowledge what had happened, to reckon with their mistakes, to honor their savior, and to commit to a future where such a disaster could never happen again. Mayor Whitmore spoke first. His voice carried the weight of a winter that had nearly destroyed everything he was responsible for. 5 years ago, he said, a widow named Prudence Calloway began preserving food in jars. The rest of us laughed. We called her mad. We said her food would spoil. We refused to eat what she offered because we were certain we knew better than a woman who had learned from her grandmother in Pennsylvania. He paused, his jaw tight with emotion. This winter, when the railroad failed and the supplies ran out and people began to die, that same widow opened her cellar. She fed us from the jars we had mocked. 800 jars. 11 weeks of supplemented meals. 4 deaths instead of 40 or 400. We are standing here today because Prudence Calloway knew something we did not, and she saved us anyway. Emmett Sloan rose next. He was the storekeeper who had refused to sell Prudence more jars. He had predicted her preserves would spoil by Christmas. Now he stood before the community he had helped mislead. I told people her food was dangerous, Sloan confessed. His voice cracked. I refused to stock the supplies she needed. I made her order jars from 60 miles away because I would not contribute to her foolishness. My children ate from those jars this winter. My wife is alive because of food I tried to prevent her from making. I do not know how to apologize for being so wrong. Ida Hollister spoke next. She was the woman who had turned away the peaches. She had said one never knew what might be in unlabeled jars. Tears streamed down her face. I was cruel, Ida said. I was cruel, and I was stupid, and I was wrong. Mrs. Calloway offered help when my baby was sick, and I refused it because I thought I was better than her. This winter, that same baby ate peaches from the jars I rejected. She lived when she might have died. I have no words for what I did or how I feel. Others spoke after her. Families who had survived on Prudence's preserves. Women who had learned her techniques and now understood what their grandmothers had known. Children who had been fed from jars their parents had called poison. When the confessions were complete, Prudence rose. She walked to the center of the assembly. She was 41 now, weathered by 5 years of Nevada sun and wind. Her hands were calloused from the work that had saved 400 lives. She had not sought this moment. She had not wanted it, but she understood that some things needed to be said. Prudence looked out at the faces in the square. They had mocked her. They had laughed at her. My grandmother used to tell me something, she said, her voice calm. Every jar was a promise. She paused, letting the words hang in the air. A promise to your future self, to your family, to anyone who might need food when the growing season was past. She looked around. The work was hard, and the hours were long. But the promise was worth keeping. She spoke directly to them. You did not understand that promise. The crowd shifted. You thought the trains would always run. You believed the stores would always be full. You were sure the supplies would always arrive. She shook her head. You forgot what your grandmothers knew. That abundance is temporary. That scarcity is inevitable. That the only food you can truly depend upon is the food you preserve yourself. Prudence offered them a challenge, not an easy out. I do not ask for gratitude. I do not ask for apology. She met their eyes. I ask only that you remember this winter. Next summer, when the gardens grow and the fruit ripens and the game is plentiful, her gaze swept across the square. I ask that you fill your own jars, learn your own techniques. Make your own promises to your future selves. She turned and gestured toward the mountains that had trapped them for months. The railroad will fail again. It always does. Eventually, the trains will stop. The supplies will end. The winter will come. Her voice was firm. When it does, let Silverton be ready. Let every cellar hold its own abundance. Let no one ever again depend entirely on a system that can collapse in a moment. That summer, Silverton changed. Every house with a garden started preserving. Prudence taught classes 3 times a week. Women and men learned how to seal jars. They processed food safely. They recognized the signs of proper preservation. The general store, now under new management since Emmett Sloan had sold his business and left town, stocked canning supplies. They bought quantities that would have seemed crazy just a year before. By autumn, the root cellars of Silverton held thousands of jars. The town that had nearly starved had become a community of preservers. Each family kept its own supply of abundance. They were ready for whatever winter might come. The phrase, keeping the promise, entered the language of the Nevada mining country. It meant putting food away during good times. It meant honoring the future by getting ready for its needs. People spoke it with quiet respect. They understood something about survival that only came from almost starving. Prudence Calloway remarried in 1891. His name was Thomas Brennan, a widower who had lost his first wife to the same fever that took Martin. Together they raised 3 children. Prudence taught every one of them to can. Her technique spread across the territory. Women who had learned from her during that terrible winter passed the knowledge to their daughters and granddaughters. Prudence passed away in the spring of 1912. She was 65 years old. She kept filling jars right up until her hands couldn't grip the tools anymore. Her very last harvest, 63 jars of preserved tomatoes from the summer of 1911, stayed on her shelves for years after she was gone. Her family opened them one by one, tasting what she had made. The root cellar itself still stands today. The Silverton Historical Society maintains it. It's a monument to the winter that almost wiped out the town. The original shelves inside are empty now. Those 800 jars have long since been eaten, but replicas show what they must have looked like in the lantern light glowing, like jewels in the darkness. Above the cellar door, carved into the wood, is an inscription. Prudence herself added it in the years after the railroad disaster. Visitors photograph it often. It reads, "Every jar is a promise kept." That phrase, "every jar is a promise kept," became the real legacy of Prudence Calloway, because the last supply train had arrived on October 14th, 1887. But the town that survived wasn't the same town that waited for it. It had learned a hard lesson. It had learned self-sufficiency. It had learned that foresight often looks like madness, right up until the moment of crisis. If the story of how one person's wisdom can save an entire community is something you want more of, subscribe. There are other stories like Prudence's waiting to be told. And drop a comment. What forgotten skill do you think still holds a promise for our future?